from a defabricated garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, tips on keeping all of your toes attached when you're revving up that weed whacker. And now, the podcast host who's got the weed whacking skills of a paid professional, Pete Dominic!
Oh, yes, that's right indeed. I know my way around the Ego String Trimmer, which is the product that I own. Of course, lithium battery-powered, operated weed whacker. And I actually learned my technique when I saw my neighbor's lawn. He had that edge right there on the curb, like a laser had done it. And I said, how do you do that, Dave? His name is Dave. He showed me with his weed whacker as he was doing it, and then he goes, "You give it a shot." So then I held the weed whacker and did it, and I was getting it wrong. I couldn't quite figure out the angle. And so he, this is about 4 or 5 inches taller than me, stood behind me and wrapped his arms around me to show me how to hold it, and did it with me while standing behind me holding me like I was a little league batter and he was my dad, the coach. It was the most emasculating, humbling, and embarrassing neighborhood moment I think I might have had. I mean, and everybody was watching. It just so happened there was a lot of people out that day. Ego got the best of me in that moment. That is for sure. I was like, okay, I got it, Dave. Thank you. Thanks. Let go of me. Also, I've been weed whacking a lot. Sorry, I'm going to carry on with this, Pete. I've been weed whacking a lot this summer without any eye protection, which has to be the dumbest thing that I've ever done in my life. Because a few times, you always get hit by some flying debris that you're whacking with your trimmer. And I got nailed. I did get hit in the eye one time, and it was I just felt so stupid, and then I did it again a couple weeks later. Anyway, hello and happy Monday. Thank you very much for joining me here on Stand Up, where each and every day I thought that the smartest people we can find, and it's we, because there are so many people that contribute to the show, that listen to the show, and that subscribe to the show. Thank you all very much for giving me your ideas for guests, for segments, for bits, for questions, for ways to build this podcast, which there are like a billion podcasts. Everybody's got a podcast. Podcasts are awesome, but this is, I'm a professional. How about that? I'm a professional weed whacker and podcaster, or broadcaster, I like to say. And by professional, I mean I'm really trying to make my living doing this now. So after as many years as I've had in television and radio, I love being able to do it from my home, my own independent thing, and I can't do it without you. I think you're going to love today's show. In fact, I know it. I have two great guests. I talked with Eric Segall over the weekend about the new Supreme Court term, which is ominous and scary. Starts today. We had a great hour-long conversation. I hope you'll listen to all of it. Before that, I've got Maura Quint. It's Maura Mondays, and we had a really good conversation where Maura really opened up about how she deals with her daily fear and anxiety, the kind that we all have, but how she's been able to conquer or at least manage it better. And it's super helpful and interesting to hear. I think you are going to benefit from hearing both of these conversations on today's episode. But first, just a couple of clicks and commentary from me on what happened over the weekend, some of the things we heard from the weekend. I try to listen to a lot of the Sunday shows so you don't have to. Well, not so that you don't have to, but I really like to listen to a lot of them or watch them in time and a half without commercials while I'm doing whatever my Sunday chores are. And I thought this next clip was the most important and interesting thing. There's a lot of good commentary about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and obviously the disaster relief and the politics around it, all important. But I thought the most important piece of commentary I heard came from Face the Nation anchor Margaret Brennan, who I think usually does a really great job, had the CBS News senior national and environmental correspondent Ben Tracy on, and I thought he did a great job of explaining kind of the most important issues around this hurricane and climate change in under 4 minutes, and I really wanted to play that for you first. So here we go. I really like this.
So, Ben, we hear Florida's Governor DeSantis say things like this is a 500-year flood event. They've never experienced anything like this. What's making the storm hit differently?
Well, I think we have to look at this in the context of climate change. And we should say, first off, that climate change doesn't cause a hurricane to happen. But scientists increasingly believe that climate change is making hurricanes stronger and more destructive. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's that the ocean waters are much warmer than they used to be, and warm ocean water is rocket fuel for a hurricane. So when one of these storms passes over this warm water, it just turbocharges this thing, and it's what they call rapid intensification. And we're seeing this more often. They actually believe since 2017, we've had about 30 storms that have rapidly intensified right before they hit the coast. And that's a huge issue for people in these coastal communities because they don't have as much time to prepare for that. And in addition to all of that, climate change is making the atmosphere warmer, and that means there's more water. So there's more rain when these storms hit, and that leads to flooding.
So taxpayers just invested this historic amount of money in trying to control climate change. That's what President Biden sold it as, and Democrats supported. You also have FEMA sending a record $3.5 billion to states to help lessen disaster impact. Is this record investment going where the scientists say it needs to go?
Well, the scientists would say that any money that is spent to more quickly wean us off of fossil fuels, to transition us to renewable forms of energy, is where the money is best spent. Of course, if you're the government, you also know that you have to deal with disasters when they happen and the impacts those are having on people and property. So they're trying to do both things here. But you talk about the historic investment. I mean, this is about $370 billion for climate initiatives. But a very small amount of that, only about $4 billion to $5 billion, is going for what they call climate resilience. So this would go to help some of these coastal communities rebuild wetlands, build seawalls, the kinds of things that you need for protection. But scientists will say, as long as we keep burning fossil fuels, we're just digging a hole and we're making that hole bigger. So that's where the money needs to be spent. That's why you hear a lot about some of the renewable energy provisions of this, the electric car credits, the things that we can do in our own homes to stop using fossil fuels.
And that's an important part of this story. But again, immediate versus long term.
Exactly. And you're going to see projects all over this country where they're building massive infrastructure projects to try to defend the coast. Mm-hmm. But the one thing most people never want to talk about is a phenomenon called managed retreat. And this is not something Americans like to hear, but it's this issue of, should we be rebuilding in these areas that are prone to get hit over and over again? And at what point does that just become financially irresponsible if you can't get insurance in these areas? So you then have people who lose their homes, their businesses, and they're just left flat broke.
And that's a question for any governor in one of these coastal communities. Ben, great context. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, great context, Ben Tracy, CBS, Margaret Brennan, CBS News. I loved that. I thought that was just so succinct. And it's the perfect question to ask a journalist who covers these things. What would the scientists say need to happen? I don't think you're going to get a better under 4 minutes than that, which is why I wanted to steal the whole thing for you to hear and be able to try to understand rapid intensification and managed retreat. Water warmer, atmosphere warmer, more storms, more rain. It all makes sense, doesn't it? Well, not to everybody. Certainly not to Marjorie Taylor Greene and the members of the MAGA cult, who over the weekend had a cult gathering in Michigan where Donald Trump himself showed up and gave a 103-minute wild rant. They chanted, "Lock her up, lock him up," pretty much every time anybody was mentioned that they didn't like. And of course, I didn't watch or hear a lot of it, but I did watch a few of the clips, including from 45, who I will spare you the guaranteed pain and suffering of having to hear him talk. But apparently he went on his familiar rant, of course. He played the hits, and a lot of people were streaming out of the venue. There's video of it from a Detroit Free Press reporter. About 15 minutes, apparently, into him talking, people were just started leaving, and it certainly wasn't filled to capacity in Warren, Michigan, where he was there to apparently support Michigan candidates, but he barely talked about them. Candidates like Tudor Nixon, who's running for governor against Gretchen Whitmer, who his followers tried to kidnap. And apparently Trump went off and thanked Ginny Thomas for not wilting under the pressure of questioning. He talked about that, which was, I guess, the newest thing that he went on a rant about. I really would like to go to one of those rallies and interview some of the people. I have lots of questions. But we heard from Ben Tracy at CBS talking about the effects of climate change on hurricanes on Florida, and then also at that Michigan rally, not to be out of the loop of anything MAGA, was the one and only Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman from Georgia, who represents the QAnon movement, anti-Semitism, racism, and so many other isms. Just everyone knows about Marjorie Taylor Greene. But I was particularly interested and triggered by hearing her after this hurricane and listening to Ben Tracy. But now listen to the Congresswoman from Georgia go into Michigan, where it is a stronghold of UAW, union workers who build Chevys and Fords. She tries to play to their, the masculinity, and then she tries to convince them, and I think she does, that driving an electric car will make you gay. Listen to what she says about the Secretary of Transportation, who is an openly gay man, and what he's trying to do to you.
More American than the roar of a V8 engine under the hood of a Ford Mustang or Chevy Camaro. An incredible feel of all that horsepower.
Oh, yeah. You don't get that feeling.
But Democrats like Pete Buttigieg want to emasculate the way we drive and force all of you to rely on electric vehicles after they shut down your great Michigan auto industry and
shutting it down. Who do you think is where do you think they're building those electric cars? If it were up to Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene, by the way, they would move all of the automobile manufacturing plants out of any of the states that have union protections, union states, Ohio and Michigan, and send them all to Alabama, where they are anti-union. Democrats and Joe Biden have invested billions and billions of dollars into their great Michigan auto industry. And President Obama, along with the Democratic Congress, saved that exact same industry by bailing them out. Remember, Mitt Romney did not want to bail them out to the tune of billions of dollars. But thank goodness that President Obama did, because we still have an auto industry and everything around it in the Midwest. It's just so hard to believe that anybody in Michigan would hear that rubbish from Marjorie Taylor Greene, an outsider, and buy it. It's also weird to think that this is going to be their strategy moving forward, to divide us down this gender line, specifically just men, what kind of a man you should be, what an American man should be. The idea of a man is more and more celebrating of masculinity. You've been hearing these kinds of clips and this kind of rhetoric from politicians and right-wing commentators. This is a huge part of what is happening in American culture. This terror, this real fear of not being manly enough, this conversation, this idea of toxic masculinity, these questions or expectations around what 2022 an American male should or should not be bore me, frankly, but we've got to discuss it, and we've got to role model the best possible behavior we can. The car that you drive, I mean, it's always kind of course, been the case. I get it. From Harley Davidsons to crotch rockets to Honda Civics with weird altered exhaust systems that make terrible, it should be criminal noises. There is this context, this idea that you're a tough guy if you're driving a certain kind of car. I don't know. I think you're a tough guy. You're a good person if you try to be a good member of society, of your community, of not making a tremendous amount of noise with your car, of not polluting the neighborhood with your car, of driving your car safely in your community. And electric cars are awesome. They are really fast. Is that not masculine enough for you? Anyway, we're going to hear a lot more of this kind of rhetoric and conversation, and we should all do our best to correct it when we hear it from our friends, neighbors, coworkers, etc. Always happy to talk about that one more and more. But now is the time of the show where I bring on my guests. Okay, I have a great conversation coming up with Eric Segall that you're not going to want to miss. A preview of the Supreme Court term, which is beginning today, if you're listening on October 1st. But before that, I've got the co-founder of the Tax the Rich movement. She is the campaign chair of the Americans for Tax Fairness organization. She is a hilarious writer, prolific on Twitter, where she's like Twitter famous at Behind Your Back. She just appeared on the Daily Beast podcast, The New Abnormal, with my old friend Andy Levy, and I got pretty jealous. That's where I start with my good friend Maura Quint, and we get really deep, and she gives great insight and advice on how to deal with anxieties and fears. So you're going to want to listen to that part of it, which is in the latter third, I think, of our conversation. But we have fun as always. Here we go. Maura Quint, Maura Mondays. There she is, Maura Quint, who is now appearing on just all the biggest podcasts. Heard you with Andy Levy. Everybody should go listen to that. If you like Maura, that was really fun to hear her with another man. I was so
like
jealous.
To watch. Yeah, you like that, Pete?
I like to watch. I do. I like you a lot, and I like Andy a lot, and I thought you guys were great together. And there was no watching. Is there video? I only listened. I would watch.
There was no video. No one turned on any cameras in that one. Although this is a weird little thing that I didn't know about because I'm not like, the whole world of doing podcasts and doing professional appearances is like, it's new to me. I feel like I'm a baby every single time. And so anytime anyone invites me on, they give me a link, and the link often is like, it's like a Zoom link, right? Like you have the option to have your camera and your sound on, and I never know what I'm supposed to do. So like, so many times I just sort of show up like smiling, like my camera's on, and I'm just like, hi, I'm here to go. And then no one else has their camera on. And I like instantly, I'm like desperately trying to turn it off because I feel like the kid on the first day of school who like showed up with the wrong clothes, just like, oh my God, it's very, I don't know why I find it mortifying, but I do.
Very funny comparison. First day of school, or just even more accurately, I'll refine it to my birthday is on Halloween, and kids would show up in costume. It was not a costume party, and a couple of kids would always show up in costume, and I'm like, no, go home. I didn't tell them.
Day. You leave your joy and your whimsy for another damn day.
We were always accommodating. We didn't bully. I never bullied, and this kid did show up as Dracula. He's the only kid. He felt left out, and I adapted quickly. I was like, you know what? Why don't we play vampire, and you just chase us?
Just make him even more the outsider. Just like, no, we're all going to run away from you in fear. Don't worry, though. You're part of it.
Well, no, I think you're wrong to analyze it that way. I think we really accommodated him.
Teasing.
I think we really accommodated his costume. I couldn't go with your improv.
I understand. I have a Christmas Eve birthday, so all my birthday parties, people just show up as Jesus. It's a real problem.
Oh, wow. That's always weird when people dress as Jesus, though, if we're going to be honest.
It's very awkward, you know? It's not right for the season.
I accidentally came upon a Mike Lindell ad for the My Pillow guy also sells sheets.
Oh, really? He's branching out? He's not doing well enough in just pillows?
Probably because I think I told you I got a big boy bed, and I was shopping for sheets, full size. I don't want to brag. And so maybe they were feeding me his ads. I don't know. Either way, or maybe I was watching some right-wing media. I forget. It doesn't matter. He was selling sheets. In the background of his video on the wall, there was this cleverly hidden silhouette of Christ wearing...
Cleverly hidden silhouette of Christ is like, first of all, that sounds like a Radiohead song or something. Like that right there just sounds like the title of something. How is it cleverly hidden? And how did you know it was Christ?
I should bring up the image for people. I don't know how I'd find it, but it was just an outline of a profile of a person, but they had the giveaway was crown of thorns.
I mean, sometimes people wear crown of thorns. What if it was just somebody, you know, who was having a birthday in a thorn patch and needed to quickly put together a little something?
Thorn patch. Or how closely, by the way, are you watching coverage of the hurricane and people talking about the hurricane, whether it's stupid idiots standing, including my friend Ali Valshiu, I love to death, but like standing in the middle of a storm reporting, which is completely unnecessary, to commentators, pundits, and politicians using it to talk about either climate change or funding or whatever political issue around this is, to obviously, you know, stories of people drowning in their roofs.
I mean, it is definitely a workplace issue. If any sort of media company is saying you have to go stand out in this insane wind and where there's like, you know, pieces of metal flying through the air, like that should instantly not be a thing that media companies should have to do. Yeah. That said, as someone who has never actually had to be in a hurricane, a little part of me is like, I want to do it. Give me a microphone. Let me see if I can stand in the strong winds, because I'm ridiculous and stupid.
But do you want to stand in a storm and film yourself and share it on social media, or do you want to stand in a storm and report to people? And by the way, when I'm watching them stand there, the reason why I'm watching it is because I'm waiting for their head to get chopped off by a shingle.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. It's terrible. It shouldn't happen at all. My saying it was just sort of a little bit facetious, but also it looks kind of fun. But no, I don't actually want to do it, and I don't really want anyone to do it. I watched this hurricane very, very intently because the person that I live with has family who was supposedly directly in the path of the hurricane. So we were like up late at night watching, trying to make calculations of like, you know, do we drive down there? Do we get people out? Is that going to make it worse? You don't want to get stranded down there. Do you load up your car? I mean, and it's a 20-hour drive. It's not like, oh, a couple hours away. But do you load up your car with gasoline and water, or is it, and then even then, where do you go? Will people be able to get out? It was all of the sort of calculations and worrying. And it was really, really frightening. And I mean, I think from what I've seen in terms of how intense this hurricane was, it at least took a maybe slightly less destructive path than was anticipated. But the real frightening element to me is that, of course, like all of these major weather events, it should be a wake-up call, or it should sort of readjust people's thinking, because you have a city like Tampa that is completely unprepared for this level of a hurricane. And unfortunately, we're going to get more. This isn't a one-off. This is, extreme weather conditions are increasing because of global climate change. It's pretty straightforward. And we need to be recognizing that and taking precautions. And of course, when I say we, there's no we, there's nobody in charge, really. There's not, a great centralized place that's going, yes, we have learned a lesson and now we will take action upon it. It's just all of us for ourselves, which is a really frustrating and terrible place to be. So it's very upsetting.
You can do. But the other thing is with media, what are they supposed to say? And my kind of thing is like, the idea that someone would say now is not the time to talk about gun violence right after a massacre, or now is not to talk about climate change during a hurricane or the drought. What do you think of people who say that? Because I generally have no patience for it. I mean, if you have a 5-minute segment or an hour segment, you take a fifth of it and you talk about like solutions and policy ideas, at least, obviously, while covering the details, if you have to absolutely cover them right now.
Well, I mean, we have to sort of pause and just say, why is anyone ever saying that? There's really only one reason to say, okay, we're not going to do that right now. And that is if there is instant information that needs to be communicated to help people in an immediate situation. Like if people need to know, hey, you need to leave your home right now and you need to go to this place. This
number
is the
one priority. Yes, great point. The number one priority is alert.
911 alert situation. Yes, I agree. The 911 alert situation should not necessarily be talking about that. But here's the thing. What that means is right now. That means the moment that 911 alert. Sorry, I heard someone the other day refer to 911 as 9/11. That's a whole separate thing. I never heard it before. I was like, what is it? But obviously, my anger at it seeped into my brain and I just used it. I'm very upset.
Thank God you corrected it. I was so triggered. I was going to wait till you were done and
it was terrible.
Really lambaste you.
It was awful to hear. And then somehow it came out through my mouth. What the heck? Anyway. But the moment that the 911 alert has gone out, and I mean the moment, then you immediately need to start talking about the why and the how and the what we need to do and what made this happen and how do we avert a future circumstance like this. So the only time that is being used, now is not the time to talk about it, is not ever because there's vital information going out. All that is being said, and I think we need to call this out, is I don't want to talk about it. That's all that's being said. I don't ever want to talk about it. People who are saying now is not the time means there is no time. I don't want to address this.
People would, but I guess the argument would be, well, no, now is not the time because people have died or people are dying. And people
are dying every single moment of every single day. So?
Not right now.
I mean, not
right this second. But,
yes, right now. 10 people probably died in the course of this. I mean, we're lucky. Neither of us happened to be the one that time, but I don't know. At any given moment.
I just want a sound effect of a body falling to the ground right now. I don't have it. I'm not quick enough. You mentioned 911. All right, let's get off the hurricane. Unless there's anything else to say, I hope everything with your friend is okay and everybody else. I mean, I talked to a lot of listeners on Thursday night who are down in Florida, know people who know people in affected areas. And, most of the time, people are okay. Most of the time, they don't have severe damage in most places, but that's not, and unfortunately, that's how we decide our opinions about important issues, much less a hurricane. Oh, it wasn't that bad. All the people that I talked to are fine. That's not how life or things work. It's certainly not how media, journalism, or politics should work in terms of making policy to affect the most affected areas. So, all right, I'm done ranting. I want to ask you about 911, which is you tweeted this week that you kept getting a phone call from your sons. What happened? Because this brings me to another question for you.
Yeah. So my kids, of course, want like cell phones and things, which we have not allowed them to get. But they have started doing things on their own where they like bike to the park by themselves, or they even, because we have a walking district, they'll walk to school by themselves. Yeah, which is like, I want them to be empowered to have that. But of course, it is also nerve wracking. So I got them these watches that like, they don't do anything. They don't have like internet or whatnot. They can just make phone calls, and they can only make phone calls to like 10 designated numbers that you program in. So they're not like, there's not much to these watches, but they can call their family basically. And that's about it. And so my son, of course, like we got him this watch and they were really excited about it and they really loved it. And then never remembers to wear it. It just never has it on him. So
really?
It's like, yeah, no, totally. To the point where I know his friends' cell phone numbers and I call them to say, hey, you guys at the park, you make it there when you're heading out.
That's like, what you need is you don't give your kid a phone, but make sure they have friends whose parents have decided to give them a phone. They'll be jealous.
It's the same way I feel about a boat. Yeah. Like, you
go ahead. I gotta
kind of friend.
Get the dog. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So the phone has then like an emergency contact. So you can just hit it real quick and it'll start like signaling, and I'm in their phones as emergency contact. And so yesterday my son was with his dad and his phone just started calling me. And every time I'd answer, I'd hear this like boom, 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 like whoosh. It sounded like the part in Sneakers where he's like locked in the trunk and you're like, he's like, I was able to figure out where I was because of the bumps that we went over. And then I heard geese. It sounded like a cocktail party, whatever. Anyway,
you were gathering the intel the exact same way. Yeah. Yeah. You're trying to guess. And you thought, I mean, imagine now at this point, you think your son has been abducted and put in the trunk?
No, I think he's just like accidentally knocking it on his wrist or something. And is just calling me while he's doing something else. Like, I wasn't actually worried, but it kept calling over and over and over. And I kept answering and like nothing. And so finally I called his dad and I was like, is Luke with you? And he's like, yeah, he's playing video games. He's right here. And I was like, okay, well, his watch keeps calling me. Is he wearing his watch? And he's like, no, I think it's just in a bag next to him. I think he just, and he's going through the bag and he's not finding it. And finally he was just like, hey, where's your watch? And I was like, he was wearing it yesterday. He's like, where's your watch? And Luke couldn't figure it out. And finally he was like, oh yeah, it's in my jeans pocket. And his dad was just like, the ones that are in the washer, which I finally understood what I was hearing, which was like this poor little watch just spinning around, like desperately calling for help. It was like signaling so desperately over and over these SOSs. And I felt so bad for it. I couldn't save it.
I'm dizzy and wet.
I'm not supposed to be
the voice of your son's watch, apparently, is Mickey Mouse watch. Well, let me ask you about this because we may have talked about this before, but your kids are obviously younger than mine. And I do think that Val and I have, we did a really good job finding the balance about, the free range versus helicopter parent thing. And I think we did a really good job empowering our girls from a very young age. And I've thought a lot about it. I feel like I've got credibility on it. And now that they're 14 and 17, I think we can attribute a lot of their independence and confidence to the way that we didn't constantly give them fears to worry about, from stranger danger to anything else that was generally irrational. It wasn't easy. We definitely worry about things, especially as closely as I pay attention to the news. But overall, I did a really good job with it. But the issue that's really also different is that we track them. We track them on their phones. And I have not read much from, some ethical philosophers about what they think about this when it comes to tracking your kids. But I have talked a lot about it with parents, and I've talked a lot about it with my daughters. And guess what? At 17 and 14, they definitely don't like it anymore.
Sure. Yeah, they do not want you to know where they are. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I would have hated that.
Yeah, and so Ava has the car now. She uses our car, and she basically considers it hers, and she mostly uses it. But, last night she went to her friends, and now we're letting her, she's a senior, she's 17, now we're even letting her drive late, or rather at night, and building that trust with her. And I see that she's at the grocery store, which is probably near the McDonald's, which they're doing late night food run. And fine, that's what we did that all the time. But it upset me that she didn't tell me she was going there. And I was like, you know what? Is it really like, I always think about us and what we did and how it all worked out, what it all meant. So I'm done talking. Your thoughts on all of it or any of it, and how you're thinking about, parenting and not making your kids worry and worrying about them too much.
Parenting is such a difficult thing. There is obviously no right way to do it. And so I would never think I had it all figured out and I could tell everyone else what they should do. But I think, or at least what I've been kind of operating under, is the belief that the trust is something that is important and that needs to go both ways. And it is also something that is earned and can be lost and maybe re-earned and things like that. But I try to sort of give my children a certain amount of freedom with some oversight and some emergency protocol, basically. So the things like a tracker, to me, I don't look at it. I mean, right now I know where my kids are. They're not going anywhere. But my expectation for when they're at the age of your children is to basically not look at it as long as everything is fine. In the same way that you see a, an action movie or something where they're you can't kill me because, I have a hitman standing outside who's going to murder your child and he's going to call me every 10 minutes. And if I don't answer, he goes ahead and murders your child. That kind of thing. The movie Ransom with Mel Gibson and Rene Russo. There you go. I haven't seen it, but that's sort of thing. What? That's kind of how I feel. I haven't seen it. That's how I feel though about I try to avoid the Mel Gibson genre. Oh, it was before we knew. We always knew. No, that's fair. Probably did. Go ahead. I basically feel as long as you have the things in place, right? Okay, you're allowed to take the car. You're allowed to go out. Here's what I expect from you. I expect you to be home by this time. I expect you to call me at this particular moment, right? Call me when you get there or text me to let me know you're at this location or text me when you're leaving or whatever the guardrails are that you as a parent and the child have agreed upon. As long as the kid is hitting those marks, is doing what has been asked, then I wouldn't track them because it's all right, then you have a bit of freedom. The tracking to me is the backup of wait a second. You said you were going to be calling me. You haven't checked in. You haven't done the things that you're supposed to do. And now I've lost some of the trust. And now I have the worry and I have this other thing that I can fall back on. But I would want to start with here's what is expected of you. It's clearly delineated. As long as you're doing that, then I'm not going to be over intrusive in what you're doing. Because I do think kids should have the right to, I don't think going to McDonald's in the middle of the night is a fuck up, but otherwise, do some general kid fuck up stuff. You gotta sneak out sometimes and go both hang out. My girls have done all the fuck ups. I think all of them, all of the typical ones that we can think of, and have gotten, out of it without too many scrapes. And it all builds or takes away from trust. But I think that's the thing. But I feel there are certain rules, I feel with parenting. You started by saying, I don't want to tell anybody else and how to parent. And I appreciate that, but I do. And okay, fine. That was very Bill Morris. Sorry. But I do. I want to tell them. Come on. Okay. Well, why do you want me to be mad at you today? I know. Specifically, I think that we have to be careful that we don't give our children our fears. Oh, yeah, sure. I agree. And it's hard to do, though. It's very hard to do. But if you start with the idea that you believe that we should try not to give them, our fears, even the realistic ones, when we do, we explain them as appropriately as we can. But the idea that strangers are dangerous is one of the, I think it's a horrible, horrible thing to do, because the truth is dangerous people are most of the time, they're people most of the time. And it makes you think. And that's how people who do, the very few people who do pray, that's how they pray. They cultivate trust and they build relationship, and then they take advantage of that, as opposed to
like some guy walking up and snatch.
Pray, Prey. I really thought you were going into like a religious thing here. Got it. Okay.
Well, we could maybe.
Pray upon others. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, oh yeah, that's how they pray. Yeah, they put their hands together and then they build trust and then they take advantage of you. I was like, yeah, no, that sounds like religion. All right.
Well, the question of giving your kids your own fears, I guess, is what I mean. We all have our own anxieties, and we're terrified that anything could happen to your kid. People don't have kids as a result of being so worried about being worried about them. I get it.
Well, this is something that I had struggled with in general. I mean, not to like deep dive and be too personal with it all, but I have made a point of walking through the world without having too much fear all the time. Like I work to not have too much fear. I work at it and I feel good about that. My kid's dad has a very different, just his way of being is very different. Well, that's
true of almost most partnerships, right? Both parents on a spectrum of that concern. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. He has a lot more anxiety and fear and like need to feel that things are safe and comfortable, which was hard to navigate. But, now it was a big thing for me that the children didn't kind of like internalize that sense of the world being a terrifying place. But, you also want to navigate that with like, but you still want them to be safe. There's ways to also just be stupid and make the world even more dangerous than it needs to be. And so you need to kind of do that balance. It's additionally, I mean, one of the things, the conversation that I have with my kids a lot too is, I mean, my kids are white boys. They walk through the world with a certain level of privilege that they will always have. And we've had this conversation because people in their immediate family and a lot of their friends are people of color and are women and are marginalized in various ways and have other identities that maybe make them more of a target, unfortunately, in a lot of places. And so we've had lots of conversations too about like how the world is going to might feel a little bit different to them than it does to somebody else, and how to even be thoughtful about other people's concerns about spaces that might seem fine to them, but might make somebody else feel uncomfortable, and like how to navigate that. I mean, like, at their level, I mean, they're still kids. So I'm like having these conversations in really sort of broad ways and kind of, maybe a little cartoonish, but like just at their level of development. But I think it's important not just that we don't put our own fears upon children, but that children recognize that the way that they might engage the world is not necessarily the way everyone is engaging the world.
Well,
I don't know. There's a lot to navigate.
Yeah, I love that, and I'd like to hear more specifics about how you do it. But let me just go back to that one thing you said, so I could get more specific on when you say you're proud of the fact that one thing you've been able to accomplish in your journey is that you generally go through life without too much fear. And so, what is your practice, your work, or your actual what you do to deal with that when a fear does come up that something could be wrong with your son, or you feel ill, like you're going down the cancer you're Googling something, thinking that you had, when I thought I had like 7 ailments at once, but it was all just anxiety.
A lot of it is for me, and is just to try and really pay attention to what I'm feeling, because I know this has been something that I've had to like work on and cultivate, but I can tell now at my very advanced age, I can feel like, am I having a gut reaction to something that is like, my body is trying to tell me something is wrong here, because I should listen to that. If I walk into a space and I'm instantly uncomfortable in that space in a way that I normally am not, that's usually like, I should pay attention to that. Something is off. There's, I should be aware and take a little bit of extra precaution in some way. I think that paying close attention to that is good. However, there's another, I certainly do have anxiety. This past week had like a sustained 2-day anxiety attack. And it was fascinating at this point because it was a heightened physical sense of like terror. And I had to sit with it for a while. And I kept going over like, what is sparking this? What am I feeling? And I kept going over everything that could be wrong. and like just crossing them off the list. Like, no, it's okay. Like maybe these things aren't great in the moment, but this is not dire. None of this is dire. You are having some sort of reaction that is irrational and that is triggered by something, who knows what, but it is not real. It's like you're under attack from imaginary demons, and you know they're not real, and you just need to weather this, basically. And it was hard. But, ultimately what I needed to do was say a lot of it out loud to other people. Like I needed to find someone to reach out to and talk to. And then I needed sleep. Like I, for me, I could recognize it was brought on by the fact that I had run myself into like a ditch and was so exhausted that I could tell I was not having normal reactions to things. But I had to be at this stage in my life, having gone through it for decades and decades, to recognize, to be able to say, here's what's going on with me. I couldn't have done that at 19. I wouldn't have known. I would have just been in a state of really heightened fear.
That's phenomenal that I call that mindfulness, sorry, but you're in the moment, you realize that you're feeling and thinking a thing, and then you can take the next step to use different resources. You suggested you diagnosed that there was a sleep issue. You talked out loud to people who you trusted, I would imagine. But do you think you could teach that to your 19-year-old self, or my daughter who's 17 right now? You do.
I do.
What would you tell a young person or someone who doesn't quite understand what you're talking about, or it hasn't been able to do what you're talking about?
I think one of the things that can be of universal help to just about everyone is to externalize. I feel like things get so much worse when we hold them in our head and we just let them kind of run through this constant avalanche. So that can be different to different people. Like some people, they really need to talk to another human being. Some people, though, can just write it down. They can just open a page and start writing. I think the moment we start to get these things out of their head, even if we think we are fine and we can see them very clearly, they just start to lessen a little bit. We start to they just don't feel as terrible once they are externalized in that way. I think that is a nearly universal thing that can just about help everyone.
But I feel just to add to that, I think I do that all the time, as you know. I've done it with you. But I think that one of the problems, I know this with a lot of guys I talk to, they don't have anybody that they feel that they feel comfortable enough, that they trust to share any number of issues. I think that's a really hard thing. Is just what you're saying is great if you can do it, but do you have a person or people?
Yeah, I don't right now. Actually, I almost called you, but because there's not too many people that I was thinking, I can turn to this person or that person. But
I'm
I think
so glad you didn't call me. I would have had nothing.
I know. I was just like, oh God, how awful would that be?
No, I think
He'd never let me live it down.
I actually think I responded that way because it's like I think about wanting to fix or wanting to give advice. But what you're saying actually is not that. What you're saying is I talk out loud about the things with a person who I trust.
Yes. I don't think it's about necessarily finding someone who can give you advice. I think it's about finding somebody who's willing to listen.
Right.
Which is, and listen non-judgmentally, right? And listen with compassion and openness. I actually don't think that advice is necessarily all that useful in those types of circumstances. It's much more about sort of just being able to get these things out. But, for people who don't feel like they have anyone, which I think most or a lot of people feel that way. That's where I think writing things down can be really, really useful. And then in general, we should be cultivating relationships where we feel like we can call someone up and just talk if need be, which is, not easy to do. It's not easy to cultivate relationships at all in general, but it's a good goal to have in mind as you navigate the world.
That's great. It's great. It's great advice. So to a young person, you would say, have a team, have a people in your life and then just talk it out. And to someone that's not going to solve it, but someone that's going to listen with compassion, which means simply, being non-judgment, but then, sometimes repeating what they say. Reactive listening is what I've heard it's called.
There's a part two. I have a second thing that I think works generally, which is, I think, physicalizing in some way, which doesn't mean go run or go work out or something. I mean, I think even if you just say to yourself, anytime I start feeling like this, I'm going to clean the bathroom. Like, give yourself a really specific task that involves physical movement. It's like, it just helps, I think, trigger your brain out of what it's doing. You know, if it's running over the same loop, it just kind of like shakes it a little bit, because now you can focus on, I don't know, maybe it's just the fumes from the bleach, but like, you know, you can focus on like, all right, I got to like get this really clean, or I got to like, it just gives your brain another thing.
I don't know if I realize how that's why I'm doing it most of the time, but I'm constantly doing. I mean, I built a new mailbox. We needed a new mailbox post, and I built this kind of elaborate like wall thing that, because I saw a neighbor had it and I thought it looked cool, so I built it. I had some scrap wood, but that's the thing I'm talking about. I gave myself that thing to do it, and by the way, everybody hates it.
Why do they hate it?
My daughter looked at it and goes, "It's not a mailbox post; it's a whole ass wall." That's what she said out loud. All right. Well, that's great advice. Really great advice.
Which is the thing I said not to do. Don't look for advice. But it's
I think I interrupted you.
At least something I found helpful.
Yeah. But doing stuff, getting out and doing a thing is another way to channel the concern, the anxiety, the fear, whatever.
I don't know. I guess maybe it's also just, I'm the sort of person who wants to like freeze in place and sit there and can't move. And you know, when it's really bad, if it's a really bad sort of thing, it's just like, there's almost a terror of like, if I move, I will make it worse somehow. Like I can sort through this. I can just figure it out in my head, and I'll, you know, and that's the worst thing that I can possibly do. But that's like my instinct is to just like, it's, you know, just absolutely freeze, which is not good. So then if I just start like, you know, doing laundry and tightening things, and even sometimes I just talk to myself out loud, even that sometimes is like, okay, yeah, right. It's okay. Okay, I can do this. Like that feeling can start to grow.
I love it. Thank you for sharing all of that. I really wasn't planning on. I was going to talk with you about the NFL and Brett Favre.
I know we were going to make jokes and stuff, and instead,
it's good.
Like,
I like
real life.
I like when we have these real life conversations because I think they're super helpful, and that you're always super helpful to me. So thank you very much, as always, Maura. What a treat to have you joining us today. Thank you, as always.
Thank you. Happy fall.
Happy fall. Next week, more on fall. She's always great. Isn't she great? At Behind Your Back. Go let her know what you liked if she said things that you liked. At Behind Your Back on Twitter. She'll see your tweet. She'll appreciate it. And I hope she'll be back next week. Maura Quint. Okay, well, as you probably already know, because I've said it a couple times, and you probably already knew because you're paying attention to the news, and you care about things and want to fight apathy, the Supreme Court term starts today. And ooh, is it looking ominous. Lots to talk about with Eric Segall. We had an amazing conversation. He was on his game explaining this stuff. It was so good, so interesting. I always love to ask him questions and hear from him, and today is no exception. He's at eSpin Segall on Twitter. You can listen to his podcast, Supreme Myths. You can get his book, Supreme Myths and Originalism and Faith. Of course, he is a constitutional law professor at Georgia State University. If you're down in Atlanta, you can stay at his guest house that he tries to act like he doesn't have, where he lives with his wife and kids in the Atlanta suburbs. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Eric Segall, the legal eagle, my good friend. Here we go. Okay, I've got the legal eagle, Eric Segall, right now, and we are talking about the upcoming term, which begins when?
Monday morning.
Right.
Today, assuming this is coming out on Monday.
I'm going to post this, I think, for Monday.
It's always the first Monday in October, which I think we should now call the worst day of the year.
When the term begins is the worst day of the year.
It's always the first. Well, actually, the worst day of the year is, worst month of the year is June. But the first Monday in October reminds us of what terrible, awful things are coming.
Okay, so Monday, October 3rd, and this, I warned you in the intro, and I warn you again, Professor Doom and Gloom is not alone. I mean, I just read the article that you actually told me to read, the columnist, Washington Post columnist, Ruth Marcus, had a great long piece about her analysis of this court's upcoming term, and it is dark.
Yes, you can't look. It's not my. This is the line I want. I know a lot of people listen to us consistently. If you're a new listener, you'll get this eventually. It's not my fault. I'm Professor Gloom and Doom. It's just not my fault. It's the Supreme Court's fault. Blame them. I'm just telling you it was how it is.
No,
So-
I mean, I disagree. I think it's the way you look at life.
No.
I'm joking.
No. Talk to me about guinea pigs or dogs or sports, and I'm a very happy guy.
I'm joking. I'm joking.
Or my wife, my family.
Yes.
Sushi. I can talk about sushi really happily for a long time.
Well, we might need to intersperse some joy in this one.
We might. We might.
The way that she titled her piece, or the Washington Post titled Ruth Marcus, is, "You thought the Supreme Court's last term was bad.
Right.
Brace yourself." So it's important just to mention that this court, the makeup of this court, and I think most people probably know to some extent what it is, but the fact that the way the makeup is currently causes them or gives them the opportunity to look at past decisions and reevaluate them, given the court that apparently, as Ruth Marcus says, Clarence Thomas has been waiting for, and conservatives have worked for a generation to build. They have that makeup now, and they're looking at the past and rights gain and won, hard fought, and thinking of removing them.
But let's be clear about something. And, this is my shtick is not the right word for this, but I'm trying to keep this light. This court is horrible, and it's full of horrible people. But the difference is only one of degree, not kind. This is more important than talking about this term. In 1857, you would have been really mad that Congress tried to end slavery in the territories, and the Supreme Court said, "No, Congress, you're not allowed to end slavery in the territories," despite the fact that the Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to rule the territories. If you were alive in 1883, you would have been really mad when Congress passed a law prohibiting racial discrimination in places of restaurants, hotels, and that kind of thing. And the Supreme Court said, "No, Congress, you can't do that." If you had been alive between 1900 and 1935, you would have been really mad when Congress struck down 200 laws or so about workplace safety and protecting unions and minimum wages. You would have been really mad. And you were alive in 2000 when the Supreme Court decided Bush versus Gore, which changed the world, because there's no war in Iraq. If that case maybe doesn't come down, you were really mad talking to me in 2013 when they decided Shelby County, which absolutely, did terrible things for this country. So this term is going to be terrible, and it's going to be bad, and these justices are bad, but they've always been bad. There's nothing else your listeners take away. Believe me, the Constitution in Article 4 says Congress can make all rules for the territories. Congress did that. The rule was no more slavery. And the Supreme Court said, "No, Congress, you can't do that." This has been going on since 1857. Sorry for the rant.
It leads us right into one of the, many of the issues. We're talking about race a lot. We're talking also about religion in this upcoming term. But when you listed those examples, I think the perfect example and place to start is with voting rights, where you can take over here, but up until I think it was 2008 with George W. Bush as president during that war you mentioned that he started, he upheld the Voting Rights Act. The Senate, rather, upheld it like 98-0. George W. Bush confirmed it. And then a few years later, the Supreme Court overturned the entire Congress on voting rights. Do I have it right?
Pretty much. It was George Bush didn't just sign it. He said we really need it. It was unanimous in the Senate, overwhelming in the House, and the court didn't strike down the whole Voting Rights Act. This is where it gets really horrific. They basically struck down Section 5, which was this thing that said states with long histories of racial discrimination had to pre-clear their voting changes with either Congress or a three-judge court because we don't want them to go back to the old ways. But in that decision, the court said there's still Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows both the people and the Department of Justice to sue states when they engage in voting procedures that discriminate against minorities. And the court then just recently interpreted Section 2 in a very narrow way to undercut what they said in Shelby County. And then this term, the court's probably going to end it. So get this. Alabama is going to the Supreme Court because Alabama is 27% black. They only have one district they have like 7 or 8 representatives in Congress. Only one district has any chance of getting a African American into office, even though the state is 27% black. I'm no mathematician, but 1 out of 7 is not 27%, I'm pretty sure. In any event, this is all about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which basically prohibits, voting procedures that discriminate against minorities.
Right.
But here's the amazing catch-22. This is Alabama's argument, and the court may very well buy it. First, Alabama says, to prove a voting rights violation in redistricting, you have to show that it was all about race, which is not what that Voting Rights Act says. So first, they want to interpret it in a way that is not congruent with what Congress meant or what Congress said. But then they say, if it's all about race, then if allowing race to get in the way of redistricting in the sense of giving minorities more of a leg up, which is what Congress wanted, then it's unconstitutional. I want to repeat that because it didn't come out that easily. They're interpreting it to say you have to prove race. But if you prove race and win, then the statute's unconstitutional. So this basically saying the Voting Rights Act no longer works at all, period, full stop, end of Voting Rights Act. And I think the Supreme Court's going to buy that. And it's just terrible in every way, especially coming from Alabama with a huge history of present past discrimination in redistricting and other mechanisms to keep blacks from voting. It's
where
terrible.
I went wrong when I explained it was I was a little too hyperbolic when I said they struck down the Voting Rights Act. What they did was they struck down in Shelby County.
One part of it.
They struck down, or as so many people said, gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which you explained what it did. But Section 2 remained. And what it sounds like I heard you just say is, oh, no, now they're going to get rid of that protection as well. Thus, the crown achievement of the civil rights movement led by Dr. King and your friend John Lewis, that achievement would be repealed, would be taken away.
Well, so they've already gutted Section 2 in a different case, but not completely. 90% gutted it. They made it so it's almost impossible to prove. This is the amazing thing. It's too complicated. It's got a lot of factors and stuff, but they basically made it impossible. This is Justice Angry Asshole Alito made it impossible to prove a Section 2 violation, but it stayed on the books. The thing about this Alabama case is there's obviously a violation. Like, it's not like they left like 10% room, but Alabama fits into that room because they're so awful. And now they're going to say even that 10% is gone. That's what's going to happen. And yes, the way you put it was exactly right. The crown jewel of the civil rights movement was the Voting Rights Act. It is the act that Martin Luther King worked with Lyndon Johnson on. It absolutely changed America. Even Justice Roberts conceded in Shelby County that it changed America for the better. And now the court is going to completely gut it, which is consistent with the court stopping racial progress in 1857, in 1883, and even in Brown. Pete, this is the thing. When I give this rant, people say, what about Brown versus Board of Education? And I say, well, that's a good case. We're glad that case was decided that way. But they forget about Brown too. No one ever talks about Brown too. In Brown, the court said separate but equal is never equal. Segregated schools are unconstitutional. Then the question was, what do we do about it? The what do we do about it question came up in Brown 2 1 year later. And in Brown 2, they said, we recognize how difficult this is going to be, especially in the South, to implement. Here's what we're telling the South, mostly. You have to do this with, quote, all deliberate speed, which in practice meant no speed, so that I said before to you, in 1964, 10 years after Brown, 10 years, the South was 98% segregated, public schools, 98%. What changed was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which changed it, because that gave a lot of money to states for their public schools, tons of money, which they desperately needed, and said the segregation under law must stop. And it was at that point that segregation under law stopped. Segregation didn't stop, obviously, but segregation under law stopped. The court had nothing to do with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the court's history on race is stopping Congress from ending slavery in the territories, stopping Congress from prohibiting racial segregation and Jim Crow in 1883, Brown, then Brown 2, which undercut Brown. And then when Richard Nixon, of all people, really pressured universities to use affirmative action, the court stepped in almost right away and said, well, affirmative action is going to be looked at very carefully by the court. And in another case this term, the court is going to end affirmative action too. I really want people to understand that the Supreme Court of the United States, throughout its history, on issues directly involving race, has almost always stood in the way of racial progress. And that's not Segall being the Supreme Court skeptic.
Yeah.
This is true.
With few exceptions.
Well, the biggest exceptions are, and this is what, for example, my friend Erwin Chemerinsky, I'm dropping a name because he's a really famous guy. When he and I talk about, he agrees with me on everything I just said. He would also add, and I agree with him about this, and the Warren Court really did a good job on criminal procedure protections, making sure that the states followed the 4th through 8th Amendments. That's not directly about race, but of course, since African Americans and other people of color are jailed in this country at a much higher rate than white people, the fact that the court tried to implement those procedural protections absolutely helped people of color. So
well, I mean, given that argument, you could say that many of the other decisions that the court made obviously disproportionately affected black folks or any other group when it comes to healthcare, education, or employment.
Yes.
And now let's talk about education with affirmative action, because as you just said, I mean, and as Ruth Marcus says, and I don't know, you can tell me because I'm not, why would I do the research? You're always honest. What is the general opinion of the scholars out there who you read and respect across the spectrum who think that this decision or this issue of affirmative action, in specifically when it comes to college admissions, right?
Yes.
Is going to be struck down?
There's no question the court is going to say that college admissions and graduate school admissions have to be colorblind. And there's two
colorblind.
Color meaning. So today, these cases involve Harvard and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Let's leave the Harvard case alone for a minute for two reasons. One, it doesn't involve the Constitution because Harvard is a private school and the Constitution only applies to public schools. It does implicate a federal statute, Title VI, which says entities that receive federal funds can't discriminate on the basis of race. Of course, Harvard and all universities get federal funds. So that case is being litigated under that statute. Leave that aside for a moment. It also involved the other case is Chapel Hill, which is all about the 14th Amendment because it's a state school, and all about this incredible statistic I'm about to give you, which is the group suing Chapel Hill claims that Chapel Hill is discriminating against whites on the basis of race. Pete, Chapel Hill is 8% black. 8%.
Well, what percent is it for others?
It's over 50% white, and then it's whatever it is with Hispanics and Asians and all that. But it's over 50% white. But the main allegation, though, is that whites are being discriminated against at the expense of the blacks. It's 8% black. At
the expense of black? That's the argument they're actually making?
Yes, pretty much. No, whites are being discriminated against because blacks get in with lower test scores. So here's what I want to say. First of all, there is no historical / originalist argument that using racial criteria to help people of color violates the 14th Amendment. In fact, as this is well known, when the 14th Amendment was passed, the Congress did all kinds of things to help the newly freed slaves come into society that only applied to the newly freed slaves, like 98% of whom were black or something. Affirmative action was used at the time the 14th Amendment was adopted, which is why Justices Scalia and Thomas, who voted against Scalia past tense, because he's dead, Thomas has voted against every affirmative action case he ever saw without ever discussing the original meaning of the 14th Amendment because he knows that's a loser. He knows he can't win on that. So he ignores it. He does cite one Iowa case from 1860, which is irrelevant to everything. So what a lot of scholars are saying in the amicus briefs, friends of the court brief in this case, is you keep telling us to rely on originalism. You keep telling us to rely on history. Colorblindness is absolutely not an historically grounded idea in a country that has been racist from the beginning.
Yeah.
Now the response to that is, I don't think this is too much in the weeds. There's a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. It's a major case in the 1890s. Louisiana said whites and blacks have to sit on separate cars, meaning blacks in the back in inferior trains. Blacks had to sit in an inferior, more crowded, in the back. The Supreme Court upheld that in clear violation of the 14th Amendment. That's another case where the Supreme Court was terrible. It was 8-1. The one dissenting justice, Justice Harlan, who is a very well-respected justice, said, we should strike this down. It goes against everything the 14th Amendment says, and we need to live in a colorblind society. So conservatives and Justice Thomas keeps citing this one solitary dissent from that case. And all of the experts, not just Segall, all of the experts respond to Justice Thomas. What are you talking about? That case was involving whites subjugating blacks.
Right.
And in that context, that's what Harlan was talking about. Harlan never had occasion to rule on the validity of whites helping blacks, which they did a lot in 1870, 1875, because no one ever thought that was illegal. That was obviously allowed. That was the whole purpose of the Reconstruction Amendments. Let whites help blacks after slavery. So it's an absurd comment. So history and originalism support affirmative action. More importantly, Justice Thomas has made a career out of citing all of the policy reasons he doesn't like affirmative action, some of which have some validity. He says it causes stigma. If you're at Harvard and you're black, people are going to think you got in, or Chapel Hill, people are thinking you got in because you're black. That's a fair observation. He also says it's going to cause backlash and whites are going to resent it. That's a fair observation. But there are many, many, many advantages of affirmative action. Justice O'Connor laid them out in what's the current law on affirmative action in a case called Grudem versus Michigan from 2003, where she said, we need to give people of color access to elite schools like University of Michigan or other schools like that, because our country's leaders, she didn't say this, but I'll say it, sadly, come from these elite schools. And in fact, the military, retired generals wrote a brief in that case saying we have to keep affirmative action at West Point. We have to keep affirmative action at the Naval Academy because we need black officers in the military.
Right.
Black officers come from those schools. If you end affirmative action, they won't get in, and this will be terrible. And O'Connor accepted that, as she should. My point there is there are policy arguments on both sides. I'm persuaded by the policy arguments in favor of affirmative action, but I'm not here to say there's no cost. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is it's not up, I'm going to curse alert. It's not up to the fucking Supreme Court, or Justice Thomas specifically, to weigh those policy back and forth. It's their job to decide if this violates the Constitution. And it does not.
It clearly does not. And they're going
to clearly say that it does. Excuse me. One last personal note on this, Pete. And I've said this before to you. I'm sorry about my voice. My law school sits 2 blocks from what used to be called the Heart of Atlanta Motel. It's now a Sheraton, I believe. But it was in 1964, the Heart of Atlanta Motel. I was 6 years old in 1964. So this is my lifetime. I know I'm old, but I'm not ancient. In my lifetime, the Heart of Atlanta Motel went to the Supreme Court and said, we want the right to exclude blacks. The Supreme Court said no, based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. My point there is, in my lifetime, the hotel 2 blocks from my law school still wanted the right to exclude blacks. Racism is not a thing of the ancient past. And my law school, public law school, funded by taxpayers, sitting in the heart of downtown Atlanta, should have the right to say, given Georgia's racist past, which no one can deny, we have the right to use limited racial criteria to make sure my law schools My law school accepts enough blacks that we can have a diverse, meaningful university that accepts this race that has been discriminated against in the state of Georgia since 1680 or something.
Yeah.
For the Supreme Court to take that away, it is terrible as a matter of policy. It's worse as a matter of constitutional interpretation. And it hits my gut personally.
Right.
Because I know when I teach con law, and this is just Segall now, when I teach con law 1 and 2, the more diverse my classroom is, the more everybody in that classroom learns.
Right. Right.
In addition, Georgia has the obligation to make the moral obligation to make up for its racist past. And for the Supreme Court justice to say no on both counts, it's almost more than I can bear. End of rant. Sorry.
Okay, well, let's move on. Very well said. Let's move on to the next issue, as Ruth Marcus writes in the Washington Post. But race isn't the only issue on which the court is poised to usher in dramatic change. Some of the cases the justices are set to hear, including the one that is hurtling its way toward a receptive court, involve the tension between religious liberties and gay rights. The buttressed conservative majority has moved cautiously but inexorably in a single direction. In the clash, religious rights prevail. That's Ruth Marcus. That's her words.
This is exactly right. And this is really sad. There's a case called 303 Creative LLC versus Alinas. That's the technical name. So Colorado, which was also the place where the Masterpiece cake shop case was litigated years ago. People might remember that one. There's a company in Colorado that does websites for weddings. You know, these days when you do a wedding, you put it on a website and people can RSVP there and see all the arrangements. The company does not want to do websites for same-sex marriages. We were back to this again.
Hey now.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing. In Masterpiece Cake Shop, a same-sex couple walked into the store and the store owner refused to make them a cake. That's a real case. That's a case. They sued. That's a case. Because Colorado law required him to do that. That's a case. This website designer has not yet been asked to design a website for a same-sex wedding. This is a manufactured case. I want a ruling in advance that I don't have to, which is not the kind of thing the Supreme Court normally does, but it's doing it here. And this case does not involve religion. And that's an important point. The court is not taking this case as a religious case. And what this case is a case where she says, my free speech rights are being violated when you make me design a wedding website against my will. And Pete, I got to tell you, this case gives me a lot of pain because I want to say two things about it. The people who run this website are terrible, awful people who want to discriminate against gays and lesbians. Let's not lose sight of that.
Oh, here comes the defense of hatred.
They're just doing hateful things to hateful people. I mean, hateful things to nice people. But I have to admit that I think there are really hard issues here under the First Amendment. Pete, if you got in the business of doing your stand-up routine at weddings, and you did not want to do your stand-up routine at a wedding of white supremacists. I'm not comparing gays and lesbians to white supremacists, of course, but the analogy is fair. If you didn't want to do that, they're all I don't think the state can make you do a stand-up routine for anybody that you don't want to do, because your stand-up routine is creative. It is speech. It is expression. Is a website expression? Yes, it is. Providing knives and forks to a wedding is not expression. Whether or not making a cake for a wedding, we can have that debate. But here, designing a website is art. Can you really make an artist do art when they don't want to do so? Now, the argument is they're selling something to the public. And the Colorado law says you have to make that available to everybody without regard to race, religion, sexual orientation. And great for Colorado. I wish every state had that law. They don't. Georgia doesn't have that law, of course. But Pete, when we're talking about expression, it gets complicated. Now, my friend Mike Dorff, who I blog with all the time and who's smarter than I am, Mike thinks that although that argument has some weight, the compelling interest in eradicating discrimination against groups that have been historically discriminated against kind of trumps the First Amendment interest. And maybe he's right. Maybe he's right. But unlike the other cases we're talking about, this is a hard case.
To be clear, the court and the law sees different services differently. A hotel has to allow anybody to stay in their hotel, religion, race.
And if you're selling widgets, you got to sell them to everybody.
Okay, but it takes when it's something speech or art related.
Yes, it's harder. I hope everybody sees that. I mean, think about it. If it were
a band, a choir,
a photographer. Forget the white supremacist.
Well, it's interesting because you turn down gigs for any work for any number of reasons, including I'm booked already.
Right. Well, that's okay. That's legal. But let's forget about the white supremacists.
Okay.
Let's say there are racist comedians who don't want to do their stand-up routine for interracial marriages, and they're bigots. Okay, it's terrible that they're bigots.
Well, I know, but it's. I guess I just get tripped up on they wouldn't be asked to do it. They're racist.
No, that this is the test case on the other side. In fact, the argument against one of the arguments in the wedding cake case was in Colorado, where that person was located. There were many, many, many bakeries that would have baked them a cake.
Right.
Why did they go into the one that would not? And because they wanted to make a point, I think, is the answer to that question. Or maybe they didn't know. But no, this is how con law works. The NAACP brought test cases all the time to try to get rid of discrimination on the basis of race. So I'm just being honest. That's not an unusual thing for constitutional law litigation.
Well, what do you see as the consequences of this case, 303 Creative, where the religious website designer?
It depends how the court defines expression. That's what it depends on. If they define it very, very broadly, then it's going to have terrible implications for LGBTQ rights. If they define it very narrowly, as I think they should, it'll have less implications for LGBTQ rights. My point is they shouldn't decide this case at all. They should wait until someone formally asks this person to design a website for them and this person says no. Then we have a real case of controversy. Now, it is true that you can bring cases in advance of going to prison, for example, if you want to violate a law that you think is unconstitutional. But generally speaking, we don't like those kinds of cases. What Ruth Marcus is saying in her op-ed in the Washington Post, which is 180% accurate. I don't know if it could be more than 100% accurate, but this is 180% accurate. The court is reaching out to decide one of the themes of her long, long op-ed was this aggressive court is reaching out to decide all these cases to make their conservative libertarian points, these were their religion points, although this case does not involve religion, that they shouldn't be doing. And I agree with her about that. This court is just reaching, like the religion cases last term with the coach who prayed at the 50-yard line. He was living in Florida. He had no intention to move back to Washington State where he was doing his praying. They should never have decided that case. And then it turns out he's in fact not going back to Washington, which is what all of us said in tweets and briefs and everything else. They reached out to decide that case because they wanted to. That's part of Ruth Marcus's theme in that op-ed, and she's 100% right. Pete, we have to move on because before we finish, we have to talk about the most important case this time.
The democracy case?
Yes, potentially.
So there's just to give people a heads up, there's one more religious freedom case, which is more starkly an issue of religious freedom, which pits a yeshiva university, which is an
But that's not there yet. Hold on. That's not at the Supreme Court yet. They haven't granted cert yet in that case.
Oh, okay.
So, that was a little bit unclear in her op-ed.
Let's move on then to the final, which is democracy. She writes is on the court's docket in a case called Moore v. Harper, which is a dispute over gerrymandering in North Carolina, not racial gerrymandering, but partisan gerrymandering, and it raises this idea that conservatives call the independent state legislature theory. Can you make this a little easier for listeners to understand than Ruth does?
I can, and I'm going to do it by telling a story.
Oh, okay? Great! I love it. Thank you very much.
And before I tell the story, you said it was partisan, not racial.
She wrote that.
Make no mistake that partisan gerrymandering in this country, in most states, but especially North Carolina, has a huge racial component.
Yeah, I thought I was thinking that too.
Yeah, it's definitely it's especially true in North Carolina and places like Georgia and Alabama. But anyway,
got it.
So let's go back before we talk about this case. Let's talk about the Rucho case from a couple years ago, where everybody agreed that Republicans in Wisconsin had just gerrymandered that state beyond imagination, and Democrats in Maryland had gerrymandered that state beyond imagination. And when we talk about gerrymandering, this is what we're talking about. Let me tell you what's not implicated. The presidency is not implicated. The Senate is not implicated because every state gets 2 senators. There's no gerrymandering. There's the whole state. The whole state votes for the president. What it does implicate is the House of Representatives, which is divided into districts, and the state legislature, which is divided into districts.
And it also does not affect the governor.
It does not affect the governor. Anything that's voted statewide is not affected.
Yeah.
But make no mistake, the House of Representatives and the state House and the state Senate are incredibly important political entities that dictate a lot of what our country does.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly important. So the court held in that case that the federal courts are not allowed to second guess partisan gerrymandering. They called it this is a kind of I'm sorry about this phrase of art, but a non-justiciable political question. Meaning we're not getting involved, and I don't want to get into it. They gave a lot of reasons. But the court said the fact that the federal courts can't do this doesn't mean state courts can't do it if they want to. By the phrase "do it," what I mean is if state courts want to review partisan gerrymandering, they can still do that. We're just not going to let federal courts do it. Okay, that's that case.
Yep.
So in North Carolina, where the Republicans did unconscionable gerrymandering in all kinds of ways, the North Carolina State Supreme Court said no. Under our state constitution, and for those of people who don't understand, Supreme Court doesn't review cases under state law. In other words, when a state court interprets the state constitution under state law, federal courts have nothing to say about that, unless the interpretation of. Let me just back up 1 second, Pete. I'm sorry.
Okay.
If the state Supreme Court gets state law wrong, the Supreme Court can't do anything about that. It is not up to the federal courts have no business there, unless it violates the federal constitution the way they're doing it. And then, of course, anything that a state does that violates the federal constitution, the Supreme Court can weigh in. So,
which is a lot, though. I mean, there's a lot there.
Yes. So the North Carolina legislature does a horrible gerrymandering. The state Supreme Court says no and redraws the map, makes them go back, makes them redraw the map. That's all very complicated. It's not relevant to the story. The North Carolina State Supreme Court tried to fix it, as they should have, under the state constitution. Why does that involve federal law? Because the state legislature is arguing that the federal constitution says that only legislatures can regulate the time, manner, and places of elections. Only the state legislature. And state Supreme Courts can't get in the way of that. And state governors who can veto legislation can't get in the way of that. Every progressive in the world, every liberal in the world, and some conservatives say that's a complete overreading of that provision of the Constitution. That when it says, which it does, state legislatures basically run state elections. Although, when I say state elections, I mean the elections for both state officials and members of Congress.
Right.
Right. Yes, that is up to the legislature. Everybody agrees. But the legislature can only do that consistent with state constitutions. Of course. The state constitution of North Carolina gives the North Carolina legislature powers to do a million different things.
Right.
But they can only do those things if they're constitutional under state law, of course. And the same thing should be true for elections. The state legislature does get to decide the time, place, manner of elections, which means redistricting. But it can only do that, of course, consistent with the state constitution. What the legislature is saying is that last sentence I said is not true. We can do anything we want, and the state constitution can't stop us.
Well, who decides how the state constitution is interpreted? Doesn't it that state's Supreme Court?
Yes, unless it violates federal law. And what they're saying is when the state Supreme Court, in this case, North Carolina, when the state Supreme Court ruled that the state legislature acted unconstitutionally under state law, the Supreme Court can't get into that. But what they're asking the Supreme Court to say is the federal constitution says state courts can't do that. The federal constitution says state governors can't do that. And that's simply wrong. It's just wrong. And that's why from 1789 to 2022, no Supreme Court's ever held that. But this Supreme Court's going to hold that.
And just to be clear, in this case, the conservatives gerrymandered North Carolina in such a way to make it impossible, almost impossible, for Democrats to win these districts because they drew lines around where the Republican voters live. That's how it works. And the Supreme Court...
Well, actually, I think, there's two... Let's be very specific about that so your audience understands. There's two ways to do it. One way is you pack all the people of color in one district. So they're going to win that district, but then they're going to lose everything else. That's one way of doing it.
But by packing, the cracking and packing, but just to be clear, it means drawing a line.
Yes.
Line,
exactly.
the district gets drawn around where the black people live.
Yes. Or they draw lines that disperse black. In North Carolina, the issue is black people. Other states, like Texas, it's Hispanics, obviously, or whatever the politically correct word is. Sorry, I keep forgetting. But in North Carolina, it's white. In North Carolina, it's white-black. Yes, they either pack them in one place or they disperse them so they have no power anywhere. And usually, and here's the thing.
Pack and disperse misleads. It makes it seem like the government is literally telling people they have to move into certain communities.
No, I'm just saying for voting purposes, for drawing district lines. Yeah, you're right. That's fair correction. And with computers, we can now do that with incredible accuracy. And they do. So forget the Supreme Court for a second. The biggest problem this country has today, other than climate change, not like that, Pete. I never used to say that kind of thing.
Thank you.
The biggest problem this country has, other than climate change, is that after the 2010 election, there has to be redistricting every 10 years after a census. After the 2010 election, Karl Rove and others in the Republican Party figured out that with computers, they can gerrymander with precision.
Yeah.
So, for example, in my home state, the percentage of blacks in my state far exceed the number of blacks in the state legislature because they packed and cracked my state. And this happened in many, many red states, including Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and other, states that are swing states, actually. And it happened completely in the red states, like, Nebraska and Oklahoma, whatever.
Yeah.
So Republicans have far more power in the House of Representatives and in the state legislatures than they would have without gerrymandering.
Right.
This is the story I was trying to tell. This Republican Supreme Court has already allowed that gerrymandering, which because of 2010 in today's world helps Republicans. They already said federal courts can't touch it. And now they're going to say state courts can't touch it either. And that will instill Republicans in this country, give them power way disproportionate to their numbers. And that is the biggest problem we have.
And I do think that the one detail that was left out is in the case in North Carolina, the North Carolina Supreme Court and everybody else basically agreed this was an egregious, including conservative justices, apparently, an egregious example of racist gerrymandering.
Yes. And
gerrymandering, drawing lines based on race. It was just completely corrupt. And so they said, you can't do that. And then
now let's circle back real quick to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This is what Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was supposed to stop, or at least make less terrible. So in the same term, the court is going to gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and take state Supreme Courts and state governors out of the ability to stop racial redistricting Even though the North Carolina case is about partisan redistricting, the motivation is, of course, racial. So people need to understand what the Supreme Court's about to do. It's about to unleash racial gerrymandering with no judicial review all over the country. Now, the Democrats do this too, Pete. I want to be clear. But the problem is 2010, many legislatures were Republican, so they had the power, and they still have the power. And there's no way for the people to undo that if these two cases get decided the way we think they're going to get decided.
Yeah. And
it's
I mean,
really
I think the reason why it obviously, most listeners probably know this, many taught me this, obviously, but the reason why the gerrymandering issue matters so much is because it manifests in rights taken or in policy. And that's why you have these, people don't realize this, but you have this overwhelming public agreement on an issue like background checks for guns, like 80-90%. But the House of Representatives, much less the Senate, but just specifically the House, won't pass what the vast majority of Americans agree because of the gerrymandered districts, right? I mean, that's like why it matters so much.
You said that better than I could. And that replays itself in state legislatures all over.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Right.
And that, so
that's why you get these absolutely insane ideas. Forget about like extremist, like racist or anti-gay ideas, but like really crazy ideas get presented or prevented from being presented by super crazy people because they can, because of this.
And Pete, it gets even worse. So buckle down. So what Georgia did after Georgia went blue for Biden in 2020 and elected 2 Democrat senators, what Georgia did is it passed a whole bunch of laws to make elections more difficult for people of color. By the way, this morning, a federal judge upheld all of that. I haven't read the opinion yet, but it's really terrible news. But in any event, the Georgia legislature passed all of these things to make voting harder. If there had been a Democrat governor, if Stacey Abrams had won in 2018, she could have vetoed that law. She could have. And she would have, obviously. She's running again. I think she might actually win. We'll wait and see on that. There's a chance she will win. In other red states, the same thing. You have a Republican legislature, but you have a Democratic governor because the state is majority Democrat, and you can't gerrymander away the governorship because everybody votes. Here's the kicker. If the court rules a certain way, Democrat governors will not be allowed to veto election changes that hurt minorities or hurt Democrats or both when red legislatures pass them. I'm going to repeat that. Normally, state governors can veto the laws passed by the legislature, just like the president can veto the laws passed by Congress. Congress requires 2/3 of each house to override a veto. Most states have similar provisions where a supermajority of the legislature must override a veto. In Georgia, that could never happen. We have enough Democrats that could never happen. But if the Supreme Court takes the power away from state governors to veto election laws, then legislatures will keep passing these gerrymandering and voter ID, and you can't pass water out to election lines and all that stuff for the rest of time because neither the governor nor a state court can stop it. That is so before I say what that is, I want to remind people that you and I in 2016 had conversations where I said that my dad used to run a company and he said some decisions are important, some decisions are medium important, some decisions are bet your company decisions. And I said electing Donald Trump as president is a bet your country decision. Well, yeah. It doesn't mean our country will end, but it does mean it could end. These 2 decisions are a possible end your country decision. It may not, but the affirmative action case, the gay rights case, those are all really important cases. I'm not minimizing them, but they're not end your country cases. This case, I'm not being hyperbolic here, is an end democracy.
When you say end your country, what do you mean? I mean, it just doesn't.
What I mean, what do you think Pete, if the Republican Party is ensconced in power for the next 30 years and Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis and Trump represent the Republican Party, which they do, what do you think is going to happen to this country?
I think what happens is the outcomes of laws are all, benefiting their ideology, which is racist, sexist, and conspiratorial. and anti-planet. But
let me tell you what happens.
But there's two things. It would take a generation for that to change, and demographics are changing rapidly in this country. Number one, and that'll be inevitable. Or, it's highly unlikely, but it's possible that more Supreme Court justices could be appointed, thus overturning some of this stuff.
Not unless there's 60 Democrats in the Senate.
And you're not going to have 60 Democrats in the Senate as long as Republicans are ensconced in power.
But again, gerrymandering does not apply to the Senate, but still, we're not going to get 60 Democrats anytime soon. Pete, here's why I say it's bet your country, and then we'll call it a day. Let's take my state, a incredibly blue, populous capital city, Atlanta, which is as progressive as any city in the United States, surrounded by incredibly conservative red counties.
Yeah, it's similar in Michigan and New York.
Sure. And not to mention Texas, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, blue, everything else red. Mm-hmm. And Austin, of course, everything else red. One of the things Karl Rove did, by the way, was deprive Austin, which is still, I think, the largest city in the United States, without a member of Congress, because he gerrymandered it in a way where Austin couldn't elect anybody. It's an amazing thing. But anyway, the reason it's a bet your country situation is because there'll come a point in time when these blue cities won't take it anymore. And Georgia's a good example of that. So Stacey Abrams, in her heart of hearts, this is all in Dahlia's book, by the way. By the way, great interview with, I'm not saying this because I was mentioned a couple of times, great interview with Dahlia.
I have you to thank for introducing us. Lending her your credibility.
That's actually not true, Pete.
No?
You forget this. Dahlia was on your, I don't want to go into it again, but Dahlia was on your show in 2012, and you invited me to come on with her because I was the con law guy. That's where I met Dahlia. That's when I published my piece in Slate about Elena Kagan.
I introduced you to her.
Yes. I knew about her, and we met, but that's the first time we ever talked.
I take the credit back.
In any event.
And congratulations to me. You were making the point that she made. Yeah, go ahead.
Stacey Abrams is running again for governor. Now, she thinks she lost last time because of cheating, and so do I. But she didn't challenge it because she says, and what a wonderful thing to say, this shouldn't be about my right to be governor. It's about the right to have fair elections. So instead of making a big fuss about her loss, instead what she did is she created all these organizations, to make sure. Yeah, she got busy. Exactly. So let's say the Georgia election is really, really close, which it's going to be. We know with some degree of certainty that there's going to be shenanigans to keep her from winning. Now, if that happens, there could be serious issues in the state of Georgia. That's just one example. How long will states with overwhelmingly Democrat majorities be willing to accept minority government? And what the Supreme Court is going to do this term is further ensconce minority governments in this country. And there comes up, it's almost like the apartheid situation, where you have a small percentage of people who are a minority controlling everybody else.
Well said.
And so Wisconsin's a great example of this. I don't have the exact numbers on me, but Wisconsin is something like 51 or 52% Democrat or something like that. Nobody hold me to this, but it's something around that. But Republicans have an enormous majority of the seats in the Wisconsin legislature. The Supreme Court's going to make it harder to change that this term. And in the long run, that's a real problem. That's cities burning. That's protests on a violent scale.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I remember that's the way I felt when they were going to try to take away the vote of Detroit. Republicans were
exactly.
I remember that night. I was like, if they do that tonight,
yes. Well, that's so.
And people would be righteous. That's why I have some sympathy for the insurrectionists that they really believe their vote. The election had been stolen because the cult that they were following, their leader told them that. I understand the indignation of thinking that.
So that the Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, that's always a problem.
Yeah.
But I would hope the Supreme Court would make it harder to get minority entrenchment. But instead, they're going to make it much easier to keep minority entrenchment. And that's why she calls this case about democracy. But when Ruth Marcus, who I respect a lot, says democracy, I think what she means is our country. That's what I'm saying.
Right. You put it even in a harsher.
She and I agree on this. We're just using different language.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, as always. Your favorite late night...
I'm really sorry for being Dr. Doom and Gloom.
Favorite late night snack?
Oh, it's a great question. Ice cream sandwich. What?
It just seems so childish.
Well, I'm kind of a kid.
It seems like a childish treat that adults don't buy for themselves.
What's your favorite late night snack? I
like to eat the pita chips and hummus.
Oh my God! Yeah, it's not a snack. That's like punishment. What are you doing?
I don't love sugar as much as I used to, and I definitely don't love it. Late at night. Although sometimes I'll take a shot of maple syrup. Seriously, just to get a sweetness.
Of maple syrup. Wow, I have to confess something. I've never confessed this on your show before.
Go ahead. It's okay.
This is going to be bad. Are you sitting down?
Yeah.
If Lynn heard what you just said, my wife, this is what she would say in response. I do something with scrambled eggs that most people think is the single most grotesque thing they've ever heard.
Oh boy, what's going to happen?
See, the reason I'm doing this is because you said maple syrup.
You put syrup on your scrambled eggs.
Well, hold on. I want to explain why I'm doing this, then I'll say it. Because I believe the non-disclosure of a material fact among friends, good friends, or family members is a lie. And since you mentioned maple syrup, I am not. If I didn't disclose this, it would be the non-disclosure of a material fact. Although your audience might think I should not have disclosed this.
Although I think you might have already disclosed what you're about to say because people talk about it. You put maple syrup on your home fries, your potatoes.
I have disclosed that. I've not disclosed this.
Oh,
there's nothing wrong with putting maple syrup on home fries.
Which should be a crime.
So this is going to be bad.
Uh-oh.
This is how I like my scrambled eggs. First, I put vanilla syrup in the when you scramble the eggs in a bowl, I put a little bit of vanilla syrup in there. That's not terrible. No, that's not terrible. Then I scramble my eggs.
It is.
Then I like this. Then I like after it's done. Now this is what I add to my eggs. I add a little bit of maple syrup. I add a little bit of Fruit Loops, and I add a little bit of crab meat, and I mix it all up. And I think that's really yummy.
Are you serious?
I'm 100% serious.
I mean, why would anyone think of such a combination of things? I mean, it sounds like you're making it up.
I'm not.
Just to be outrageous.
You can ask Lynn.
Who even has those items?
Well, I love fake crab meat. I make crab meat quesadillas.
Not even real crab meat.
No, I love real crab meat, but it's like $75 a can now. Huh. So I buy the fake crab. So I often have fake crab meat with cheese and make a quesadilla out of it. But what I really like is the eggs, the crab meat, the Fruit Loops, and just a little bit of maple syrup.
It's fucking disgusting. You're disgusting.
I love that. That's one of my favorite things to eat. It's really good.
You should be shamed, like in every way, including like a violent. Like a whip, like you should be whipped.
Many years ago, we had my cafeteria at work was really bad, and for breakfast there were limited options. So there was no crab meat in that cafeteria, but there was Captain Crunch, and there was maple syrup.
It. Well, I appreciate you at least explaining the origin. This was about walking into the cafeteria and there's breakfast.
My dean saw me. My close friend. Dean saw me.
You let somebody see you eating this?
Scrambled eggs, Captain Crunch, and maple syrup. And he said to me something to the effect of, he's a good friend. Derek, you've been I'm not going to be overly modest here. You have been a great, addition to our law school. Your public persona really helps us. And if I see you do this again, you may in fact lose your job. Because you're not going to be healthy. You're not going to be healthy enough to help us in like 3 years. So you might
something happened in your childhood, though, about these.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah, you were deprived of, I guess, Fruit Loops. Wow,
I freaking love Fruit Loops.
Well, this is going to cause a real controversy, and I think you should have to come into the next hangout and defend it.
I will do that. Except I teach, Pete. I've told you this before. I love your hangouts. I teach from 6 to 9.
We'll schedule nights. Whenever it's convenient to you, so there can be an audience of people to flog you.
Okay. I want to say one last thing. Despite this last story, which is totally honest, that I just told, because I don't mind revealing myself to your audience, don't lose sight of what happened before that, which is we're about to embark on a Supreme Court term that has the potential to really. Okay,
that was unnecessary. Nobody was losing sight of that. That's why I was changing the taste in the moment. We're going to think back at that conversation later.
I want to end on that point, not my scrambled eggs with Fruit Loops or Captain Crunch, maple syrup, and crab meat.
Goodbye, sir. Gross.
Goodbye.
Thank you. All right, there he goes, Eric Segall, everybody. For all of those of you that listened all the way here to the end, I know it was a long one today, an hour and 45 minutes or so, but I hope you appreciate it. I certainly love doing it, love these conversations. Can't do them without you. If you're not already supporting the show with a paid subscription, head over to standupwithpete.com right now and find out more of Eric Segall's horrific disgusting recipes there. I called him out on Twitter over the weekend, and you should too. Also, thank him for joining me. Okay, that's it. That's all I've got for you. I will talk to you tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening today. Be the change you want to see in the world. John Carroll taking us out.
That's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand